My name is Dorothy de Beck, daughter of the great departed fighter ace Guillaume de Beck. My friends call me Didi. Actually, when all this began back in July 41, I had only one friend, Tommy Carter. He'd flown with my father in the Great War. Tommy raised me. He joked that God had forgotten to give me feathers. On my 14th birthday, he told me, "I've never known anyone so uncomfortable on the ground, but so at peace in the air." I probably shouldn't have been flying at that age, but Tommy didn't seem to care. He wanted to teach me, and I wanted to learn. Tommy and I had survived well enough back then. We smuggled, bartered, and stole, taking any job that required a pilot. But the war changed everything. The world was on fire and the flames were closing in around us. The skies were no longer safe. But Tommy was right about me. There was no way I was staying on the ground. Our resources dwindling, Tommy and I decided to recruit a maverick mechanic called Clive Greer, an Australian by birth, a wanderer by inclination, a drunk by character. No one else would take him, and he took pay in whiskey, which worked well for us at the time. I didn't expect a neatly pressed uniform and a brisk salute, but Clive still came as a shock. His overalls looked as though they'd been dragged down the runway and back, and he smelled as though he drank more fuel than he had put in the planes. But for all my misgivings, there was something about him that appealed. Like us, he was an outsider, a reject, trapped in the middle of somebody else's war. Give him a weekend and a pile of scrap and Clive can make a bathtub fly rings around a Messerschmitt, Tommy promised. And, like a good girl, I trusted his instincts. For better or worse, we had our mechanic. Group Captain Gerald McIntyre had been a friend of my father's, or so he said. Maybe his willingness to hire me was in memory of that friendship. Working for McIntyre had its advantages, but I'd found that men of high office often had low morals. I bristled at being so easily pulled into the British military machine. I was being used, but for as long as I benefited, I could live with it, and I needed money to stay in the sky. Every night we drank in makeshift bars. Clive would regale us with news from the grapevine, painting an ominous picture of Rommel closing his fist around Tobruk. Clive was extremely keen for us to move on. Tommy, perhaps nostalgic for his glory days, wanted us to stay. I had no desire to leave lucrative work behind, but the atmosphere was changing every day, choking the life from the city. One way or another, I sensed our time here was running short. Under cover of darkness, stomachs knotted with fear and worry. The truck bumped along dirt roads, while my thoughts churned. Ahmed was relocating us to Azerbaijan. Clive still had contacts there. I felt powerless, my destiny controlled by others. Resting my head on Tommy's shoulder, I closed my eyes and dreamt of happier times. As a girl, I would gratefully put aside my wrench and oil can at the end of each day and listen to the stillness, feeling the early evening sun on my skin, hearing the birds sing to each other. Nights were a time for warm bread, chilled wine and stories. My favorites were Tommy's tales of his time flying alongside my father, a man who I only ever knew through legend and hearsay. Was a thug, a bully and a criminal. Clive had worked with him before the war, but clearly didn't trust him. If we'd had a choice, we would have worked with another colorful, honorable scoundrel like Ahmed. Trouble is, you don't always have a choice. Morozov needed pilots to do his dirty work for him, and this time he wouldn't be flying with any official sanction. Unlike McIntyre with his neat moustache and pressed uniform, Morozov did not look at me with disdain or arrogance. There would be no coded meanings or coy military euphemisms. We would be exploiting the war and getting paid for it. The lack of pretense, at least, was refreshing. Morozov was clearly a villain, but I thought his love of money would protect us. As it turned out, he had his mind on a bigger game, and his greed would put us in far greater danger than I had ever imagined.
Broadcasting to the free people of Europe.
That was how she introduced herself every night. And every night we would huddle around Tommy's battered radio set to wait for Night Owl to broadcast her messages of hope and defiance in 3 different languages. We knew of the Red Orchestra, of course, a Russian resistance movement operating throughout Europe, fighting the Nazis at the risk of their own lives. Nothing to do with us, there's no profit in resistance, I thought. But there she was, talking to me. And she knew what was going on, what the Nazis were after in Azerbaijan, what Morozov had been chasing, an experimental Russian aircraft codenamed Black Wing. Look at that moment. My head span and my teeth ached as I ground them together. The world became a dull roar. All that existed was Morozov's plane perfectly framed in my sights. I felt a brief moment of satisfaction as he fell from the sky. Smoke curled from his plane, flames licking hungrily around its engine. I spitefully hoped that he was still alive to feel the terror of that moment. I like to think that I wasn't myself. To kill in war is not murder, but Morozov had made me a murderer. All those innocents in the factory I bombed, it was unforgivable. And my vengeance against Morozov didn't wash clean my sins. It was yet more blood on my hands. I had learned that money cannot pay for everything. I first saw the ruins of the Neretva Bridge, not 2 months since I'd flown solo to protect it. It wasn't even the Nazis who destroyed it in the end. The plan was sheer madness, yet I had to admire the gall of the partisan fighters. With their backs to the river, panzer shells ready to rain down on their heads, they dared to bluff the might of the German army. The explosion shook the town to its foundations, but was it enough to fool the enemy into thinking the partisans were pushing to the north? The Neretva Gambit illustrated a kind of courage I had never imagined. That bravery seemed to be at the heart of all the resistance forces I fought alongside. Even though their war was already lost, there was no capitulation, no surrender, and no despair. Even Clive seemed strengthened during those days, seeking solace less often in a bottle, and more through his actions, working to improve my chances in the air. The British army was supporting the Chetnik resistance, since the King of Yugoslavia was being sheltered in England. But the Chetniks' own atrocities had raised eyebrows in London and led to Captain John Edwards being sent to assess the situation. The People's Liberation Army were keen to accept overseas assistance, and Edwards was clearly impressed by their courage and organization. In the midst of the chaos of the war, Edwards offered a welcome taste of hope. Despite working undercover with the Slav resistance, witness to terrible fighting and painful sacrifice, his mood remained positive. With despair a constant temptation, his resilience was refreshing, attractive even. Tommy warmed to Edwards as well. I realized later that maybe the dashing young officer, so certain in his morals yet strangely carefree in his attitude, reminded him of a soberer version of my father. I was able to fly, to preserve some distance from the bloodshed, but on the ground it was inescapable. The massacre at Sudjeska hung over the country like a shroud. Resistance was weakening, resolve was breaking. To come so close only to be so cruelly cut down, it was too painful to contemplate. We flew to Korčula. The island camp had been devastated, but we salvaged some fuel, some motor parts, some vile food. McIntyre joined us there to confer with Edwards. I reacted with little more than weary resignation. He offered work, which at least provided a distraction from the bleak mood I found myself slipping into. There was some action in Poland, and McIntyre wanted to influence it. More resistance men fighting impossible odds, he promised us. We had nowhere else to go. To my surprise, the despair seemed to take the edge off McIntyre's insufferable pomposity. His formal manner slipped away like the skin of a snake in the face of such loss and sorrow. I expected him to tire me with mission details and operational requirements. But instead he spoke of my father's old squadron, those faces so familiar from Tommy's old photograph. Macintyre's latest Polish operation, Operation Hydra, had been a great success. Tommy, Clive and I lived amongst the RAF pilots for a time, hiding from the Nazis at a secret airfield which had been prepared for us by the Polish resistance. I occasionally flew short smuggling flights, mostly to fetch vodka. As the days passed, I spent less time with Tommy. After all we had been through, Tommy had seized upon the comradeship of his countrymen with relish. He even discovered that one of his old squadron was at the camp, a man named Archie Lincoln. I recognized Archie from my father's old photograph and wondered if he knew anything of my father's fate, but I didn't ask. My mood was bleak, and I was exhausted from lack of sleep. The massacre at Sutjeska some weeks ago still haunted my nightmares. I spent more time with Clive, and inevitably this meant a lot of drinking. Tommy clearly didn't approve, especially when I took a plane up while I was drunk. But even at his most frustrated with me, Tommy never touched a drop himself. I found myself wishing for word from Night Owl. If I had to help someone, I'd rather it was her than McIntyre. Bullets before I heard them. A dozen juddering hits that tore through the metal and ripped the heart out of my plane. Then the noise came, the terrifying metallic shriek of the ricochet. A cold, high whistle as the air howled through the line of quaint-sized holes in my fuselage. The stick locked into place, the engine spluttered, and died. In that moment, though I never heard it, I fancied I could hear my father's voice. "Tally-ho! Into the drink again!" But there was no water beneath me, just unyielding earth. I have little memory of what followed, beyond landing hard and staring up at a blue sky, painted white and black with clouds and flak bursts. It was Clive, not Tommy, who comforted me afterwards. He reassured me, gave me brandy, and told me everything was fine. At the time, it seemed like the most normal thing in the world. Archie Lincoln was as I had imagined him to be. A gruff, friendly bear of a man, with a generous pipe of tobacco permanently puffing away from beneath his bristles. He had a pronounced limp, a souvenir of previous campaigns. As the camp celebrated Operation Belt, he approached me to share vodka and stories of the past. I think he was curious about me. McIntyre had been very much the same. Once again I got the impression that these men, rough, tough flyers all, had been a little in awe of my father. But I had no past, only the stories passed on to me of the man who was my father. My image of him was becoming clearer, but there were still many questions to be answered. As the drinks flowed, Archie gave me another piece of the puzzle. A coded message, designed to baffle both Allies and Germans alike, brought our time in Poland to an abrupt end. The militant fighters of the Maquis had personally requested our presence in France. I felt strangely honored. Our contact there was to be a woman called Ivana Marovich. Stylish and glamorous, her presence commanded respect from everybody in camp. Strangely, nobody could tell us anything about her. All we knew was that she was vital to the French resistance. It was Ivana who had asked for our help. Her manner was familiar, if somewhat cold. I suspected that she was, in fact, Night Owl, but her identity was clearly a closely guarded secret, and so we all proceeded as though she were a stranger. In Vercors, there had been an outbreak of influenza. What we laughably called field hospitals were rudimentary at best, and there was little that could be done to stem the epidemic, beyond isolating the sick. As the days passed, more and more people fell to the potentially lethal disease. Haunted by the fear of bombs and bullets, it was easy to forget that everyday perils could still strike us down. It wasn't that I'd been unaware of Tommy's faltering health, but knowing that he would rather fall where he stood than see a doctor, I hadn't pressed the matter. I was a fool. Influenza had claimed the lives of thousands across Europe, as disease and infection followed in the wake of war. Germs couldn't be shot down or driven to ground through grit and determination. Sickness was an enemy that even Tommy couldn't bluff. He insisted it was nothing, that he could still fly and fight. But eventually his body betrayed him, and he collapsed to a hospital bed. I had come to Vercors to defend the sick and the wounded. Now I had a personal stake in the fight. Alongside death for so long that we had taken it for granted. It was always there in the backs of our minds, but it was a fear that could be caged and controlled. Death was something that happened to other people. As Clive's plane tumbled from the sky, little more than a smoking casket, I realized how numb we had become. Ice water filled my veins. My heart pounded. Our luck had finally run out. I thought back to how casually I had dismissed Clive as a drunken fool, a hindrance as much as a help. I thought how touched and surprised I was to discover the sweet-natured man beneath all the booze and oil stains. Most of all, I prayed he had died quickly, and had not burned to death while pinned beneath the wreckage of his plane. Fled Vercors, I found myself alone. Tommy was too deep in his own dark thoughts to offer any illumination, and too drunk to boot. Ivana had moved on, too important to attend to a simple evacuation, and Clive was dead. Searching for an ally, I approached René Devereaux, another of the faces in Tommy's old squadron photograph, another friend of my father's. That he'd ended up with us at Vercors didn't surprise me. War heroes seemed to turn up where they were needed in times of trouble. But I felt foolish going to see him only as we fled, as if I couldn't bring myself to talk to him before. I was in no mood to be regaled with more drink-fueled tales of daring do, so René's brusque demeanor suited me just fine. The time for jovial reminiscing was long gone. I suddenly needed details, answers and facts about my father. It felt as though I was on the brink of a new life, a life without friends, wingmen or guardians. Where I had come from seemed more important than ever before. Months following Clive's death, our sorrow hardened into anger. Not just at the Nazi forces that had taken him from us, but at the war itself, the endless violence, the hopelessness that crept up on us in our unguarded moments. Tommy and I went where the war took us, throwing ourselves on the mercy of its savage tide. Tommy lost himself in the fighting. We volunteered for every sortie, every bombing run, every patrol we could manage, just to be in the air, wreaking destruction on the enemy. We didn't care who the enemy was anymore. It scarcely seemed to matter. He drank more than ever, rows of whiskey glasses solemnly downed, the liquor mixing with his seething emotions to fuel our increasingly desperate way of life. I was losing him. Maybe I could have saved him if I hadn't been so lost myself. The view from the sky can be cruel. From that distance, the horror is disguised, diminished. Is this how God sees us? If so, perhaps it is no wonder that he seems to have abandoned us. Night Owl was gone, I was sure of it. This realization affected me more than Clive's death. Clive was a friend, but Night Owl had begun to feel like part of me, like a voice inside my head, like the better part of myself. Night Owl was brave, where Blackwing was scared. Night Owl was compassionate, where Blackwing sacrificed others for her own survival. Night Owl resisted monsters like Morozov, while Blackwing capitulated for money. I wanted to be Night Owl more than I wanted to be Blackwing. Without her voice on the airwaves, I felt more alone than ever. Again, McIntyre had found us in the chaos of war. He had sent a package to Tommy, pulling on the kind of strings that we could only dream of. He had sent us an invitation to return to Yugoslavia to join a unit he was forming there. It was clear that I was to do more than run errands for him this time. His secret war was coming to fruition, and my intuition told me that if I were ever to learn the truth about my father, it could only be from McIntyre. No one else had the complete picture. The pieces were falling into place, and a faded letter McIntyre had included in the package seemed to be a part of that. It was from Bull Peterson, another member of my father's old squadron, written years earlier. The envelope was torn and dirty, and it had already been opened. Had McIntyre intercepted the letter years before, and only now decided to let me read it? To Jeska, I had promised myself that I'd never go back. The last time I was here, in June of '43, I saw brave men and women defend their homeland with ingenuity and courage, only to be massacred for their trouble. And the first thing I learned upon arrival was that Savo had been killed, heroically of course, but that meant so little to me at that point. Tommy and I were the last of the pilots McIntyre had recruited for his RAF Balkan squadron. Even in person he wouldn't tell us his long-term goal. We were merely performing exercises, the sort that inevitably led to the death of one or more of the participants. I let the missions distract me from the aching I felt inside. For Tommy, McIntyre's squadron was a chance to continue his drink-fueled crusade against the so-called Third Reich. We fell into routine, and slowly began to loosen up. Difficult to believe we were actually at the outskirts of Berlin. The RAF Balkans men couldn't have been happier. We'd all lived through the filthy, brutal conflict with one thought buried deep inside, that one day, the war must end. I didn't share the general elation. In '41, I had been a carefree whiskey smuggler with a powerful sense of entitlement. By '45, Dorothy de Beck was a very different woman. I felt I was taking someone else's path through life, walking a road with two branches. One that had been chosen by McIntyre, the other by Night Owl. But somewhere, I must have taken a very wrong turn. In Azerbaijan, Yugoslavia, Poland, I couldn't quite remember. All wars must end, that seemed clear. But so many people had died. I felt an eerie chill in my bones. Surely such a monumental conflict could not end without one final blood sacrifice. The thought of losing Tommy had crossed my mind 100 times. Every time we took to the sky, there was the chance that one of us wouldn't come back. But it seemed so impossible. Tommy had always been there. No matter how selfish or bad-tempered I had been as a girl, Tommy always had been exactly where I needed him. He was more important than the sky to me. Now he was gone and I was truly, utterly alone. I cried. I was numb. Berlin burnt around me as I tried to find some tiny fragment of my life to cling to. But there was nothing left but ashes. It was only later that I realized that Tommy had always been my father. Guillaume de Beck was just a story. I had followed that story across the world, and Tommy had been with me every step of the way. It was so obvious. Tommy, I'm so sorry. You were my father, and I love you. There was one thing left to do, to see how the story ended. Tommy had told me that McIntyre knew the truth, so I challenged him. His proud demeanor instantly evaporated, and his shoulders slumped with the relief of knowing he could finally unburden himself. He must have been waiting to do so since that first day we had met in Tobruk. The war had ended. Apparently we won. The newspapers declared it a victory, but all I could see was relief etched into faces drawn too thin, too haunted by years of suffering to cheer and smile. I take solace in the fact that Tommy and Clive, and all the many others who fell along the way, did not die in vain. I couldn't see it at the time, but now I realized that what seemed like horrific, senseless acts were small, painful steps along a necessary road. And I was not alone for long. Captain John Edwards and I found ourselves in the rubble of Berlin, dazed by the abrupt advent of peace. At first, I was just glad of a pair of arms to fall into. I think he was too. But before we knew what was happening, we were married and building a future together. I think Tommy would have approved. He liked John when they met. I think he reminded Tommy of Guillaume. A more sober version of Guillaume, perhaps. I miss you, Tommy. And Clive, and Ivana, and all you others. Perhaps I should raise one final toast to the memory of those horrible, incredible times after all. Tally-ho. Into the drink again.